This is the Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 21st chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. After he appeared to his followers in Jerusalem, Jesus showed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast your net to the right side of the boat, you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise. So sometimes, as we read the Easter stories, we're tempted to think that as soon as the disciples realized that Jesus was alive again, they all became happy and joyful and effortlessly pivoted to this new way of living and proclaiming the gospel to very far off places. But as today's gospel reading points out, that really was not the case. After Jesus' resurrection, the disciples were in a time of transition. They weren't really sure what to do, where to go, or what was coming next. And so they headed home, and they did what they had done before. They went fishing. And during times of transition and confusion, it's often comforting to go back to doing what you know. So Todd Bolsinger, who is the author of a book I've talked about before, Canoeing the Mountains, points out that when we get to moments of deep disorientation, we often try to reorient around old ways of doing things. We go back to what we know how to do. And that's what Peter and the disciples did. They went fishing. It was in the context of fishing that the risen Jesus met them for the third time since his resurrection. And then, in one sense, Jesus tells Peter to go back and do what he had also done before. Follow me. It's not new. It's almost the first words out of Jesus' mouth in John's Gospel. Follow me. It's the old thing. But now, following was going to have to be different. And it would have been great if Jesus had told Peter exactly how this following was going to be different. I mean, surely it could not be the same, because the disciples could no longer follow Jesus around as they did before. The disciples were now being called to have agency and responsibility for their work, and not simply sit back and do whatever task Jesus told them to do. And the disciples were now in a journey that wasn't simply going to go on for a couple of years. They were in it for the long haul, for the rest of their lives. So how was this following going to be different? And what was this transition to the new way of following going to look like? Jesus does not give a nice blueprint, or at least if he did, John's Gospel does not report it. Yet it does seem from this story that the transition to following in a new way would mean realizing that Jesus was with them, even when they couldn't see him in the same way as before. John's gospel has no ascension narrative. There's no, Jesus lifted up his hands and he's carried off into heaven and something like that. The idea seems to be that Jesus is always present, but that he shows himself periodically to remind his disciples that he's still there and to give them some direction. That's always the phrase that John's gospel used. Jesus shows himself, and off they go. And what they're supposed to learn from that is that Jesus is always there, always present with them, always helping to guide them, even if he's not there showing himself to them. This new way of following, it's pretty clear, would mean doing some of the same things, but in different ways or with a different emphasis. One of the things about most transitions anyway is that they are not like a light switch. You don't just switch them on and off. Okay, we did it like this, now we're doing it like this. Instead, most things move gradually from one thing to the next. Even fishing. Most of the disciples were fishermen and they still needed to make a living. Part of the reason they go back and they fish is because, hey, we got to eat. We got to feed the family, right? And Paul also, if you read the book of Acts, he's a tent maker. He's got to figure out, how can I be a missionary and be the tent maker? And how do we re-examine and relive how we do some of these old things? But transitions, they take time, and therefore they required patience and experimentation to see what would work for the future. And maybe that's why Jesus did not give them a hard and fast blueprint. Transitions are just kind of messy. They take time to work out. And this new way of following, it's clear, would also mean resisting the notion that eventually things would go back to the way they were. So there's this ominous line at the end about, indicating the kind of death by which Peter was to die, and you're like, what way was that? And then he doesn't tell us, because everybody theoretically knew that. But the idea here is that Peter is reminded that his life is really going to be different as it moves forward. It's not going to be back to the way things used to be. And sometimes the biggest hindrance to following in a new time and a new way is the even subconscious desire to get back to the way things used to be. So this Sunday actually marks the 1-year anniversary of us being back together in in-person live worship. Woohoo! It was the first Sunday of May last year. And in this past year, we have had to continue to adapt and to live into a lot of changes. And in some ways, it kind of feels like things were like they were. We're back in live church, many of us. We don't have to wear masks anymore. And we are again planning big events like coffee house and yard sale. And yet, things really are different than they were, and not just for us, but for the world around us. And like Peter and those first disciples, the risen Jesus is still calling us to follow him. But it's clear that a year into being back, that the way we follow Jesus isn't going to be just like it was before. And it's not entirely clear how things will look next year, the year after. Planning and visioning is still kind of sketchy. There were times a few years ago where you could just sort of say, well, this is our program, and we're going to do it next year, and the year after, and the year after that, and the year after that, and it's all going to keep working until Jesus comes. And clearly, COVID has shown us, don't do that. But as today's gospel reading points out, that's always been the way transitions in following are. They're always messy and complicated, and maybe the best advice our gospel reading has for us this morning is the same message as those first disciples had to hear as well. That is, as we learn to follow in new ways, even when it's not exactly clear what the new way will look like, it will certainly mean trusting that Jesus is still calling us to follow and still leading us, even if it looks and feels differently than it used to. And the very fact that things we were used to just a couple of years ago were very different from the ways that things were like when many of us were kids growing up in the church can give us the confidence that, God transitioned us before, God will help transition us again. And Jesus is still showing us and leading us into new ways of following. Part of our new way of following is going to be being willing, or being willing, not only to drop old things and add new things, but to adapt what we've done before in different ways. Sometimes, when we've talked about change or transition before, we've talked about you got to be able to drop the old thing that's not working anymore. You got to be able to start this new thing that we think will work. But a lot of transition means thinking about how some of the things you've done and some of the things you've never done aren't going to be done exactly like that, but you can pick up a little bit of this and this, and maybe somehow put it together in a different way. I've been thinking a lot lately about Jesus' words about anybody who's a follower needs to pick out of their treasure that which is old and that which is new. And it's not just the old thing or the new thing, but how you put them together and how you maybe tweak them a little bit in different ways that gives us a new way of following. That's what the disciples were being called to do. That's what we're being called to do too. And also for us, following in new ways means really being self-aware of how our deep desire to get back to normal, which I say all the time and lots of us say, we want to get back to normal. That is, to the way things were. Sometimes that can be the biggest hindrance to follow in new ways. At least I know that's the way it works for me. And perhaps the best way to resist that urge is to be open to the unexpected times and places in which we end up feeling like, gee, Jesus really is revealing himself to us, and it happened by the grill, and I didn't expect that, but maybe that's the new way. Maybe this is a new way I'm being led to. Follow me. That's what Jesus' call is. Those were Jesus' final words to his disciples in the Gospel of John, and they're still the best final words to us too. But the way we're called to follow may be different from the ways Jesus calls others to follow. And it will clearly be different from the ways we ourselves were called to follow just a couple of years ago. So for us too, Jesus reminds us to rely on his presence and to be open for the times and places that Jesus reveals himself in our lives. Jesus calls us to patience in transition and constant willingness to adapt. And Jesus calls us to look for what God is preparing for us in the future, instead of simply trying to find a way back to the way things were.